Start. The 9,667th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestine questions. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Tor Wennesland.
Mr. President, members of the Security Council, before turning to my regular briefing, allow me to express my serious concerns about the risk of escalations in the region, particularly between Israel and Hezbollah along the Blue Line. I reiterate the Secretary General's concerns that further military escalation will only guarantee more suffering, more devastations to communities in Lebanon and Israel, and more potentially catastrophic consequences for the region. In complement to the efforts of UNSC and UNIFIL, I'm encouraging all sides to immediately take urgent steps to de-escalate the situation. The ongoing hostilities in Gaza are further fueling regional instability. There must be an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. There is a deal on the table, and it should be agreed, and fast. I welcome the efforts, including by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, to reach such a deal. The UN stands ready to support its implementation. I will now turn to my regular briefing on the situation in the Middle East, devoted to the 30th report on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334. The Secretary General's written report covers the period between 19 March and 10 June 2024. Since the submission of the written report, intensive hostilities between Hamas and Israeli Defense Forces in Gaza have continued, resulting in hundreds of fatalities. The devastating impacts of the hostilities on the civilian population in Gaza and the unprecedented humanitarian crisis remains deeply alarming. I have witnessed myself the deterioration of the security situation on each of my visits. Ongoing military operations and a near total breakdown of civil orders have resulted in multiple reported incidents of thefts of relief supplies and shooting that pose significant risk to the population and humanitarian workers. A shooting incident on 15 June that resulted in the killing of 2 Palestinians while an aid convoy was on the road prompted the cancellation of convoys to Kerem Shalom between 16 and 18 June to mitigate risks. Effective mechanisms for humanitarian notification, safe conditions for humanitarian operations, and sufficient access to humanitarian needs remain sorely lacking and must be put in place without delay. Following another series of serious security incidents this last weekend impacting humanitarian actors in Gaza, the UN welcomes the opportunity to clarify with the IDF on how the current situation can be clearly improved. Hunger and food insecurity persist. While projection of imminent famine in the northern governorates have been averted through an increase in food deliveries, Food insecurity has worsened in the south. Nearly all of Gaza's population continues to face high levels of food insecurity, and nearly 500,000 people facing catastrophic insecurity. I welcome the high-level conference convened 11 June in Jordan by Jordan, Egypt, and the United Nations, which urged all parties to do their part to ensure that we can fully address the urgent needs of the population in Gaza. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority's fiscal situation remains very precarious amidst broader economic and security concerns across the occupied West Bank. Announcement by Israel's finance minister that he intends to continue blocking the transfer of all clearance revenues to the PA and to take measures that would end corresponding banking relations between the Israeli and Palestinian banks at the end of this month, threatened to plunge the Palestinian fiscal situation into an even greater crisis, potentially upending the entire Palestinian financial system. I take note of the recent appointment by the head of Israeli military civil administration of a civilian deputy and the delegation of authority to that position for oversight of many areas of land management and development, planning, and day-to-day life in Area C of the occupied West Bank. That the appointment and delegation of authorities is expected to expedite Israeli settlement expansion and regularization under Israeli law of illegal outposts is concerning and undermines the prospects for a two-state solution. Mr. President, allow me to reiterate several observations by the Secretary General regarding the implementation of the provisions of the Security Council Resolution 2334 during this reporting period. I once again strongly condemn the horrific armed attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Israel on 7 October 2023 and the continued holding of hostages in Gaza. Nothing can justify these acts of terror. All remaining hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. The use of human shields and the firing of indiscriminate rockets towards Israeli population centers are violations of international humanitarian law and must cease completely. The scope of death and destructions in Gaza has been catastrophic and horrifying. Israel's use of explosive weapons in densely populated areas has destroyed entire neighborhoods and damaged hospitals and other civilian infrastructure, schools, mosques, and UN premises. I unequivocally condemn the killing and maiming of civilians in Gaza, including of women and children. The protection of civilians is paramount in any armed conflict. International humanitarian law applies to all parties to a conflict at all times. The impact of the ongoing hostilities on the humanitarian situation in Gaza is deeply concerning. The life-threatening conditions facing the more than 1.7 million internally displaced people in Gaza, where nowhere is safe, must be addressed immediately. The level of essential goods, including humanitarian assistance that has been unloaded into Gaza, continues to fall short of meeting the needs of the population. While it is positive that Israel has opened additional entry points for humanitarian aid, others have been closed, and it's imperative that all necessary access points be opened and made operational, and humanitarian access to be sustained. All parties must protect humanitarian workers at all times. Attacks on humanitarian aid workers and facilities are unacceptable, must cease immediately, and should all be investigated. The financial contribution of donors to UNRWA are welcome, and further financial support is needed to meet the needs of Gaza and throughout the region. However, attacks on the agency's facilities and activities are deeply concerning. I remain deeply troubled by continued Israeli settlement expansions in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. I reiterate that all Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, have no legal validity and are in flagrant violation of international law and relevant UN resolution. I urge the government of Israel to cease all settlement activities immediately. The escalating violence and tensions in the occupied West Bank, including Jerusalem, are deeply worrying. Intensified armed exchanges between Palestinians and Israeli security forces, alongside lethal attacks by Palestinians against the Israelis and by Israeli settlers against Palestinians, have also exacerbated tensions and led to exceedingly high levels of casualties and detentions. All perpetrators of violence must be held accountable and swiftly brought to justice. I urge Israel to ensure the safety and security of the Palestinian population. I reiterate that security forces in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, must exercise maximum restraints and use lethal force only when it's strictly unavoidable to protect life. I am encouraged by the PA's reform plan. The UN will continue to support the PA's implement critical reforms, and urge the international community to provide immediate support to address the PA's financial challenges, strengthen its governance capacity, and prepare it to resume its responsibility in Gaza. Mr. President, Palestinians and Israelis can no longer wait to establish a viable political horizon. Efforts to address security and humanitarian challenges that ignores or sidestep fundamental political questions are doomed to fail. All stakeholders must urgently take steps that will lead towards a two-state reality. The UN will continue to support all such efforts. The UN remains committed to supporting steps towards ending the occupation and resolving the conflict in line with the international law, relevant UN resolution and bilateral agreements in pursuit of the vision of two states, Israel, and an independent, democratic, continuous, viable and sovereign Palestinian state, living side by side in peace and security within secure and recognized border on the basis of the pre-67 lines, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. I thank you.
I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make a statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Special Coordinator Wennesland, for your briefing today and for your latest report. The world's eyes are rightfully on Gaza, but we cannot ignore the situation in the West Bank. Last year saw the highest number of Palestinians killed in the West Bank since the UN began collecting data in 2005. 6 months into 2024, the number of Palestinians killed in the West Bank remains deeply alarming. We're concerned by the significant uptick in deadly violence against Palestinian civilians by settlers in the West Bank and condemn it in the strongest terms. We urge Israel, working in coordination with the Palestinian authorities, to prevent these attacks. Colleagues, we reiterate our position that advancing Israeli settlements in the West Bank is an obstacle to achievement of a two-state solution, the end state we all want to see as we seek to bring the fighting in Gaza to a close. Further, we reiterate our belief that Israel's program of support for the expansion of settlements is inconsistent with international law and only serves to weaken Israeli security. In addition, we remain deeply concerned about violence committed by extremist settlers in the West Bank. As you know, the United States has sanctioned a number of extremist settlers and their organizations involved in acts of violence. We have also sanctioned the violent extremist Israeli group Zad 9, which has repeatedly sought to thwart the delivery of aid to Gaza, including aid transiting the West Bank. And earlier this month, the United States designated a militant Palestinian group, Lion's Den, for violent activity in the West Bank. These sanctions, implemented under an executive order that aims to promote peace, security, and stability in the West Bank, make clear that we will act in response to acts of violence in the West Bank, whoever the perpetrators may be. And we will use the tools at our disposal to expose and promote accountability for those who threaten peace, security, and stability there. To that end, we commend the Palestinian security forces as well as the Palestinian Authority for their efforts in maintaining peace and security in the West Bank. It is also essential the Palestinian Authority have the resources it needs to pay the salaries of those security forces and more broadly to govern effectively. The U.S. government will continue to engage the government of Israel to release the full clearance revenues due to the PA on time every month, including the transfers that Israel has not sent since April 5th. We encourage all members here today to provide support as needed in the interim to mitigate against a potential PA financial collapse. Of course, Israel and Palestinians need to have faith in the Palestinian Authority's ability to govern as a non-corrupt, faithful actor working in the interest of the Palestinian people. It is essential, therefore, that the Palestinian Authority work to reform itself and that it do so as quickly as possible. Colleagues, with regard to Gaza, a few weeks ago the Council adopted Resolution 2735, which urged Hamas to accept the deal put forward by Israel and called on all parties to implement the 3 phases of that deal. Unfortunately, Hamas has eschewed the calls from this council and ignored voices from across the international community. In fact, rather than accept the deal, Hamas has added even more conditions. But we have not given up. We're working closely with Egypt and Qatar to see if there are ways to bridge the gaps and achieve an immediate ceasefire with release of hostages. The reality is that as Hamas continues to ignore this council and the readiness of Israel to move forward on a deal, the world is not standing still. People are suffering every single day. Palestinian children, women, and men suffering every single day. From our perspective, it's time to end the intransigence from Hamas, start a ceasefire, and release the hostages. We will continue to do the hard work on the ground with Egypt, Qatar, and Israel to make that a reality, and we encourage all UN Security Council members to support those efforts. As we've said since October 7th, ensuring the sustained delivery of aid to people in need both into and within Gaza is a top priority. This is a message we have delivered consistently and will continue to reiterate going forward. As the latest IPC report makes alarmingly clear, humanitarian needs inside Gaza are catastrophic, and humanitarian assistance must be scaled up and reach all in need across all of Gaza. With much of Gaza's population facing catastrophic levels of hunger, the situation is at risk of worsening rapidly, especially with sustained disruptions in aid flows. We also consider the security of UN personnel and aid actors on the ground a top priority, and we continue to press Israel to create better conditions for facilitating aid delivery inside Gaza. In order for humanitarian organizations to be able to safely continue their life-saving work, the IDF must implement concrete actions to protect humanitarians and improve the overall security environment inside Gaza. The lack of an effective deconfliction mechanism nearly 9 months into the conflict is unacceptable and continues to put humanitarian actors at tremendous risk. But again, we cannot ignore that Hamas is standing in the way of the deal that this council endorsed and continue to put Palestinian civilians at risk. From our perspective, it's time to end the intransigence from Hamas, start a ceasefire, and release the hostages. We will continue to do the hard work of diplomacy on the ground with Egypt, Qatar, and Israel to make that a reality, and we appreciate the support of all UN Security Council members to maintain and strengthen their support of these vital efforts. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, we wish to express our sincere gratitude to Mr. Tor Wennesland, United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, for his important briefing. Mozambique welcomes the report of the Secretary General of the United Nations on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334, covering the critical period from March to June 2024. This milestone resolution, adopted with 14 votes in favor, could not be clearer in its scope and content. It emphasizes inter alia that Israel immediately and completely ceases all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, as these activities are illegal and constitute a flagrant violation of international law, as well as a major obstacle to the achievement of the two-state solution and a lasting peace. B, that all parties must take steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror, as well as all acts of provocation and destruction. C, that both parties must act in accordance with international law, including international humanitarian law, and that they are under the obligation to fulfill their previous agreements and engagements to de-escalate tensions and build trust and confidence. D, further calls for the intensification and acceleration of international and regional diplomatic efforts for credible negotiations in the Middle East peace process based on the relevant United Nations resolutions, the Madrid terms of reference, and the other related instruments. Mr. President, unfortunately, reports from the ground, as expounded by the Special Coordinator, indicate that the current situation in the Middle East contradicts the tenets of this resolution. This is a matter of great concern for us, as is for this entire Council. We note with concern that in addition to the catastrophic situation in Gaza, where there is a complete disregard for human dignity and international legal instruments on conflict, illegal settlement in the occupied territory continues. We are deeply concerned over the continued demolitions of local structures, leaving many people unprotected, with implications that undermine the efforts for peace in the region and the implementation of the two-state solution. The reiterated tensions and violence in the Gaza Strip must come to an end. This protracted conflict threatened to expand to other countries in the region, which could worsen the humanitarian crisis among refugees and displaced people. We call for the immediate de-escalation of this conflict and for the parties to exercise the maximum restraint and abide by the Security Council resolutions, including Resolution 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. Mr. President, Mozambique supports all diplomatic initiatives by the international community, the countries of the region, the United Nations, and the active and tireless involvement of this Council to find the best ways to bring a lasting peace in the region. As we have stated time and again, the only alternative to the conflict between Israel and Palestine lies in the solution of two independent and sovereign states that will be living side by side. We reiterate Mozambique's strong support for all initiatives aimed at bringing lasting peace and security in Palestine and in Israel. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, and I also thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing. The situation in the occupied Palestinian territories remains dire. It is extremely troubling that since 7th October, over 500 Palestinians, including over 100 children, have been killed at the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. A large part have taken place during intensified operations by Israeli forces. Several casualties have resulted from settler violence. We stress that Israel, as the occupying power, must exercise maximum restraint. It must abide by its obligations under international law and protect the Palestinian population against all acts or threats of violence. Israeli illegal settlement expansion, demolition of Palestinian property, and forced evictions must cease. Settlements are illegal under international law. They constitute an obstacle to peace, threaten the viability of a two-state solution, and are pushing the West Bank to the precipice. Malta is also concerned at the figures of the grave violations reported in the Secretary-General's report on children and armed conflict. We hope that Israel will engage with the Secretary-General and with the wider UN to address the concerns referred to in the report. These include the verified detention of hundreds of Palestinian children from the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We echo the Secretary-General's call on Israel to resort to the use of detention only as a last resort for the shortest period and to prevent any violence or ill treatment of the detainees, in line with their obligations under the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We also share his extreme concern regarding the escalating tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, which would provoke further devastation and human suffering in the region. President, Malta reiterates its firm conviction for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We also underline our repeated calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held since the heinous 7th October terror attacks. The ground offensive into Rafah has only exacerbated the dire humanitarian conditions and led to the further displacement of over 1 million civilians. The recently published reports by the OHCHR and the International Commission of Inquiry raised deeply alarming conclusions regarding the alleged commission of crimes under international law, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. All parties to the conflict have an obligation to respect the principles of international law, including international humanitarian law and its principles of necessity, distinction, proportionality, and humanity. Furthermore, the provision of humanitarian aid cannot be dependent on a ceasefire agreement or tactical pauses. Parties must ensure the unimpeded, safe delivery of humanitarian aid at scale into and across Gaza. The implementation of the relevant Security Council resolutions and the full, immediate and effective implementation of the orders of the ICJ remains essential. President, de-escalation and the revival of a political horizon must remain a core priority. Key to this are efforts focusing on fiscally and politically reinforcing the Palestinian Authority for effective governance over both the West Bank and Gaza, and its inclusion in discussions of a recovery plan for Gaza. Regional and international backing to ensure the PA's stability and credibility is crucial. Recent Israeli actions, which threaten to undermine the Palestinian Authority's fiscal stability, undermine this and must be reversed. The international community must rally behind the credible and irreversible realization of the two-state solution. Pivotal to this are the fulfillment of Palestinian aspirations for statehood and assurances for Israel's security. To conclude, President, Malta reaffirms its unwavering commitment to a political solution based on a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as a future capital of two states living side by side in peace and security, in line with all relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I too would like to thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing. Mr. President, since the terrorist attack on Hamas on the 7th of October and the taking of hostages, which Slovenia continues to condemn, this Council has spent hours and days debating the situation in Gaza. At every meeting, members of this body called for ceasefire, for release of hostages, and for distribution of humanitarian aid. We also called for full respect of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We were united in arguing against military operation in Rafah. We unanimously voiced our concerns in several press elements and statements. Despite all differences and challenges, we have adopted 4 resolutions demanding a ceasefire, release of hostages, and humanitarian aid. Yet again, as we meet here today, we continue hearing the same accounts of situation in Gaza, accounts of desperation, destruction, hunger, and danger, with women and especially the children suffering the most. Not even a glimmer of hope, but more dead, more maimed, more traumatized Gazans. And hostages still being kept in the tunnels of Hamas for 9 months without any contact with their families or the ICRC. It seems that both Hamas and Israel continue to use civilians, Gazans, and hostages as instrument of pressure on the other side. But they are human beings exposed to horrific and inhuman treatment and suffering for long 9 months. Extreme hunger is still present in Gaza. Slovenia is deeply troubled by obstacles to delivery of humanitarian aid and basic services. We underline the prime responsibility of Israel as occupying power, in line with the 4th Geneva Convention, to ensure food and medical supplies for the population, not merely allowing its passage. Only the cessation of hostilities, in conjunction with sustained humanitarian access, can reduce the risk of famine. We are deeply concerned by persistent attacks on civilian and UN infrastructure, as well as on safe zones and humanitarian personnel. The attack near the ICRC office on Saturday and the strike on UNRWA aid distribution facility on Sunday prove yet again that this Council's arguments, concerns, demands, and decisions remain ignored. We were promised improvements in the deconfliction mechanism. We were told safe zones will protect civilians. We were guaranteed investigations in incidents leading to massive casualties among civilians and humanitarian workers. We have seen little to nothing on all these promises. I believe that my delegation is not the only one deeply disturbed and frustrated. We expect our last resolution to be implemented by both sides, but a follow-up to its non-compliance will be needed soon. The Council must find a way to have it done and delivered. Mr. President, Slovenia is alarmed by the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, including the events that unfolded during the Flag March, the continuing movement restrictions in the West Bank, increase of the disproportionate use of force by Israeli security forces, and the number of raids. The abuses, such as the one in Jenin on Saturday, are unacceptable, and we note that IDF itself marked it as violation of orders and standard operating procedures. We remain concerned over advancement of settlement plans, demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures in front of our own eyes. We are deeply concerned about impunity of persistent settler violence affecting population in the West Bank and aid delivery to Gaza. Colleagues, assaults on the United Nations, its representatives and entities are an attack on what its membership created through decades of multilateral cooperation. We are concerned by the increasing challenges UNRWA is facing, and in this regard, we would like to invite Member States to join the shared commitments on UNRWA as an expression of support to the agency and its mandate. Slovenia expresses its support to the government of the State of Palestine as it undertakes much-needed and anticipated reforms to regain trust of the Palestinians. We regret that the deteriorating fiscal situation of the Palestinian Authority is putting severe limitations to these endeavors, and we are deeply concerned over the decision of Israel to seize the Palestinian Authority tax revenues. On the 4th of June, Slovenia officially recognized the State of Palestine. Our recognition was a demonstration of our commitment to a two-state solution. We see it as the only guarantee of lasting peace and security for the State of Israel and the region, for Israelis and Palestinians. The road there can lead only through negotiations between two equal and sovereign entities. Mr. President, in recent months we have often spoken about the danger of regional escalation, including in the Red Sea and between Israel and Iran. With war drums beating louder along the blue line, our fear of miscalculation is growing by the day. We call on both parties to show restraint, commit to full implementation of the Resolution 1701, and use UNIFIL liaison and coordination mechanisms. We welcome the efforts of France and the United States in offering their good offices. The Council should unanimously urge both parties to engage in these discussions and de-escalate. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we thank the Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Tor Wennesland, for the detailed briefing on the situation on the occupied Palestinian territory, including the Gaza Strip and the West Bank of the Jordan River. For 9 months now, the Israeli operation in Gaza has been ongoing. In this time, more than 37,500 Palestinians have been killed. Most are women and children. The number of wounded has surpassed 86,000 people. There are tens of thousands of people who are missing. More than 1,500 Israelis and foreigners have also died, and 120 people continue to be held hostage. In the Strip, the civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and houses, have been almost completely destroyed. The statistics on the West Bank are appalling. Approximately 600 Palestinians have been killed. Approximately 130 are wounded. More than 5,000 have been wounded. The former are children. As a result of Israeli security raids over the past 24 hours, at least 20 Palestinians have been detained. According to the data from the Palestinian Commission on Detainee Affairs, since 7 October 2023 on the West Bank, 9,345 people were arrested. In parallel, on the occupied Palestinian lands, new Israeli settlements are continuing to be erected. Local residents are being evicted from their homes under the pretext of lacking permits issued by the occupying power. What appears horrifically cynical is the following situation. Palestinians are being forced to themselves demolish their homes in order not to have to pay the costly levies for this to the Israeli construction workers. The magnitude of violence by the radical Israeli settlers, as well as their complete impunity, are shocking. In response to the killing of a 14-year-old Israeli boy from Malachi Shalom, despite the fact that the alleged criminal was swiftly detained, angry mobs of settlers burned down 37 villages. They killed 4 people and wounded another 91 Palestinians. What is most horrific is the fact that this lawlessness was being perpetrated in full sight of the law enforcement officers. This all illustrates the vicious cycle of violence on the occupied Palestinian territory, which inevitably fuels radicalization on both sides. There is only one solution, namely to root out the culture of impunity and end the illegal occupation of Palestinian territory. Turning to the operation in Rafah, all members of the Security Council talked about the unacceptability of this, and yet, alas, it is going forth full steam ahead. Resolution 2735 about some kind of a deal, the result of which should have been a ceasefire. Oh, this at least was what the U.S. authors alleged or proposed, is not working. What has been sold to the Council in the guise of a solution for saving Gaza, this kind of a cat in a sack, as we warned, turned out to be dead letter. What is even worse, in the resolution of the Security Council, a blatant lie crept in. There is it is explicitly stated therein that Israel consented to the peace proposal of the international mediators. However, in West Jerusalem, this has not yet been confirmed. They at the same time announcing the decisive intent to completely destroy Hamas. Ultimately, none of the phases stipulated in Resolution 2735 has been implemented. The Council essentially was blindly dragged into a misadventure and moved towards blessing a scheme which from the get-go had no chances of being implemented. We urge the membership of the Security Council moving forward to adopt a more conscientious approach to those decisions which they support and to give thought to their actual content. The bleakest scenarios regarding the consequences for civilians of the Rafah invasion were borne out. In an attempt to reach to the Hamas commanders, Israelis rained down indiscriminate strikes on refugee camps, and this resulted in heavy civilian casualties. We all recall the devastating IDF airstrike targeting Tal al-Sultan in Rafah on 26 May, when 45 Palestinians died at the same time. And only 2 days before then, the International Court of Justice handed down the third ruling on provisional measures with a demand for the Israelis to end the military operation in Rafah. This was another blatant demonstration of Israelis' egregious violation of Security Council resolutions, General Assembly resolutions, ICJ rulings, the norms of international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions in its capacity as the occupying power. To this, we should add the unbearable living conditions of Palestinians who were evacuated from Rafah. They lack basic shelter and sanitary conditions. They lack access to medicine and drinking water. According to UNRWA, 69% of schools where displaced persons from Gaza sought shelter, 69% of those schools endured and continue to endure daily bombardments. We demand that Israel halt the operation in Rafah. We also call upon all parties to immediately, unconditionally cease fire, release hostages, and the detained Palestinians. Amid intense hostilities, what is absolutely impossible is to provide for safe and sustained access to those in need. Nor can the situation be remedied by what the senior coordinator of the UN Sigrid Kaag launched. I refer to the special humanitarian mechanism for Gaza. The main channel for delivery of assistance through the Rafah crossing and the Kerem Shalom crossing are both closed. nor has what the Americans erected, the floating pier, nor have the hopes for this been realized. The transportation of cargo was halted against the backdrop of its destruction due to inclement weather. Now is the time, President, to consider how to preempt the recurrence of this escalation of Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There's a need to launch a negotiations process on an equitable basis between the Palestinians and Israelis on the range of final status issues, the result of which will be the establishment of a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel in accordance with the approved international legal rulings. We believe that the membership of Palestine at the United Nations would help bring this to fruition. In this context, we wish to applaud the decision of a host of Caribbean and European states to recognize the state of Palestine. Thereby, they acted to reaffirm a willingness to redress a historic injustice where one state was granted membership at the UN in 1948 and another state was denied this legitimate right for 3/4 of a century now. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing on the Secretary General's report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. The report provides another grim picture of developments in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and, sadly, highlights the ever-widening chasm between the legal obligations of the occupying power and the latter's compliance with those obligations. The Council must act urgently to stem this tide of impunity and to end the indignities that the Palestinian people are subjected to on a daily basis. Guyana is concerned that settlement activity continues unabated in the occupied West Bank in violation of Resolution 2334 and has noted that the occupying power recently made the largest declaration of state land in the occupied West Bank. These actions, coupled with the ongoing demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures, directly threaten the viability of the two-state solution, since they are a continuous encroachment on Palestinian territory while simultaneously displacing its lawful residents. We call on Israel to immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory. We underscore that the establishment of Israeli settlements in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967 has no legal validity. The level of violence that accompanies the occupying power's illegal activities in the occupied Palestinian territory is distressing. We have seen, for example, recent reports of the Palestinian man who was strapped to the hood of a military vehicle and in his injured state driven around a neighborhood in the West Bank. What accounts for this level of barbarity by one people against another? It is the cultivation and perpetuation of an ideology that dehumanizes the other, thus making it possible to devise and execute all kinds of violent and oppressive acts against those seen as inferior. By continuing to promulgate this ideology, Israel remains a constant threat, not only to the well-being of Palestinians, but also to the values of the United Nations, of which it remains a member state. Guyana urges this Council to seriously consider how it might use the tools at its disposal to stop Israel's atrocities against the Palestinian people. On this latter note, Mr. President, the current situation in the Gaza Strip remains of deep concern to Guyana. We were hopeful that this Council's various resolutions, including Resolution 2735, supporting the efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, would have yielded a ceasefire and the release of hostages and detained Palestinians, but this has not yet materialized. In the meantime, this man-made catastrophe has gotten worse, characterized by, inter alia, a record death toll, starvation, disease, destruction, and displacement. Amidst these realities, It appears that the Israeli Defense Force has incorporated a strategy of bombing refugee camps, where thousands of Palestinians are now living in extremely vulnerable conditions. This war must end now. We reiterate our calls for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, bringing an end to this hell where women and children bear the brunt of it. Guyana also stresses the importance of adequate humanitarian access into Gaza using all available routes, and calls on Israel to facilitate the entry of adequate goods into Gaza to meet the needs of the besieged and ailing population. This is the legal obligation of Israel. We, as member states of the United Nations and members of the UN Security Council, are duty-bound to ensure that justice and obligations under international law are upheld. Mr. President, allow me to reflect briefly on the provision contained in Resolution 2334 for all states to distinguish in the relevant dealings between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967. Here, I would like to emphasize that greater due diligence must be exercised by all member states to ensure full adherence to this provision in all their commercial dealings with Israel. We cannot simultaneously condemn the illegality of settlements and engage in the trade of commodities produced in those illegal settlements. There must be consequences for those who flout their obligations in this regard. Let me conclude by once again emphasizing the urgency of halting the violence in the occupied Palestinian territory and ending the war in Gaza. We call on the parties to prioritize the lives of innocent civilians who continue to suffer with no end in sight. I call on this Council to prioritize accountability and to send a strong message of deterrence to those who hold the view that they can continue to kill and maim innocent civilians without consequences. Finally, I urge a redoubling of efforts to achieve the two-state solution. This is the just end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we must reevaluate our strategies for achieving it. Guyana remains committed to this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I thank you for organising this meeting, and my thanks also go to Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland for his briefing. The situation in Israel and throughout the occupied Palestinian territory and the rising tensions along the Blue Line are alarming. This Council's attachment to ensuring that all parties respect international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights, is also in the interest of avoiding an even more serious regionalisation of the conflict. In the West Bank, attacks, threats and intimidation by Israeli settlers against the Palestinian population in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, continue with virtual impunity. Switzerland condemns these attacks, in which the number of civilian victims was already reaching record levels before the 7th of October 2023 and has since increased significantly. These attacks must stop. Resolution 2334 calls for immediate steps to prevent all acts of violence against civilians, including acts of terror, provocation, and destruction. Allegations of disproportionate use of force and acts of violence against civilians must be investigated, and those responsible brought to justice. Switzerland recalls Israel's obligations as an occupying power under international law, including the obligation to protect the civilian population. Switzerland also points out that the Israeli settlements are illegal under international humanitarian law and, according to Resolution 2334, constitute a major obstacle to the achievement of the two-state solution and the establishment of a just, lasting and comprehensive peace. Recurrent announcements by Israeli leaders and measures to expand them contribute to the escalation and must be stopped. Switzerland notes with concern recent Israeli decisions to transfer the management of settlers' civil affairs in the West Bank to the Israeli civil administration. In accordance with international humanitarian law, Israel must refrain from taking measures that would introduce permanent changes, in particular demographic and administrative changes, in the occupied territory. In Resolution 2730, this Council reaffirmed the responsibility of states and parties to the conflict to respect and protect the civilian population, including humanitarian personnel. Infrastructure and property used for humanitarian relief operations, as well as convoys, must also be respected and protected. This includes UNRWA premises, including in East Jerusalem, as well as ICRC premises. President, Resolution 2735 was adopted on the 10th of June, and Switzerland emphasised that it currently represents the best chance of ending the appalling conflict that has claimed tens of thousands of victims since Hamas's acts of terror on the 7th of October, which we strongly condemned. Despite the 4 resolutions adopted by this Council, hostilities in the Gaza Strip continue to expose hundreds of thousands of civilians, including a very large number of children, to danger, forced displacement, and an increased risk of starvation and famine. Similarly, dozens of hostages remain in captivity in Gaza. Switzerland reiterates its opposition to the current offensive in Rafah. It recalls the provisional measures ordered by the court, the International Court of Justice. These are binding, so Israel expects Israel to comply with them. We reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire to facilitate the safe, rapid and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid by all means into the Gaza Strip, and for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Those held captive in connection with the conflict must be able to be visited by the International Committee of the Red Cross and receive the assistance and protection to which they are entitled. Finally, this Council must continue to support the two-state solution, which is the only foundation capable of guaranteeing peace between Israelis and Palestinians and stability in the region. We must contribute to rebuilding, without further delay, this foundation of 2 democratic states, Israel and Palestine, of which Gaza is an integral part, living side by side, in peace, within secure and recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I wish to thank Mr. Wennesland for his briefing, and I wish to assure him of France's full support. With the adoption of Resolution 2735, the Security Council demanded that Hamas accept, as Israel did, the U.S. peace plan and urged both parties to fully implement the provisions thereof without delay and without any conditions. This resolution must finally be implemented pursuant to Article 25 of the United Nations Charter. France demands an immediate ceasefire and the release without delay of all hostages. We condemn the barbaric terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on 7 October 2023. France opposes the operation underway in Rafah, which resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of civilians. In line with the ruling of the ICJ, Israel has an obligation to immediately halt its military operation and any other action in the Rafah governorate. The delivery of assistance must not be obstructed and should benefit the civilian population. France calls for strict compliance with IHL. President, as the situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate, Israeli settlement activity is accelerating in the West Bank. France condemns this policy, which runs counter to international law and which imperils the prospect of achievement of a two-state solution. We will never recognize the illegal annexation of territory nor the legal recognition of illegal settlements. France condemns violence perpetrated by settlers. We deplore the forced displacements of Palestinian communities. We're determined to impose new sanctions against violent settlers. Tensions in recent weeks in Jerusalem are alarming. We call for the avoidance of any measure which may result in conflagration of the situation in Jerusalem and the West Bank. The historic status quo on the holy sites needs to be safeguarded. France and the European European Union do not recognize Israeli sovereignty on the areas that came under Israeli administration after 5 June 1967. France, alongside partners, sees to it that there be compliance with international law, including compliance with Resolution 2334. The policy of distinction is geared towards enactment of the legal distinction between the territory of Israel, which is internationally recognized, and occupied territories. There is a need now, more than ever before, to lay the political foundation for the implementation of two-state solution, the only way to deliver peace and security to both Israelis and Palestinians. We reaffirm our commitment to Israeli security and to the establishment of a state for the Palestinians. We are proactively mobilized to that end alongside parties, and together with international and regional partners, we support a reformed Palestinian Authority that is capable of exercising its authority throughout all the Palestinian territory, including the Gaza Strip. Israel must no longer obstruct the transfer of revenues to the Palestinian Authority. France is alarmed by the heightened regional tensions, which pose a risk of conflagration, particularly between Israel and Lebanon. We remain engaged in preventing any escalation along the blue line and engaged to the advancement of a diplomatic solution. We urge all stakeholders in the region to adopt a responsible approach. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for his briefing. The conflict in Gaza has been ongoing for over 8 months and caused unprecedented destruction and a humanitarian disaster. The international community has long since reached an overwhelming consensus. The GA, ESS, and the Security Council have adopted many resolutions calling for an immediate and durable ceasefire. The release of all hostages and the removal of obstacles to humanitarian access and effective protection of the safety of the humanitarian workers. After announcing a 3-phase ceasefire proposal on May 31st, the U.S. spearheaded the adoption of Resolution 2735 by the Council, urging Israel and Hamas to accept and implement the proposal. At the time, the U.S. claimed that Israel already accepted the ceasefire proposal. Regrettably, until now, we haven't seen tangible signs from Israel of its agreement to a lasting ceasefire. On the contrary, we have witnessed its continued large-scale military operations and repeated attacks on refugee camps in Rafah, Nusrat, and Gaza City, again and again resulting in new and major casualties, and putting UNRWA, ICRC, and other humanitarian institutions in danger. There must be an immediate ceasefire, and once that is achieved, there should be no restart of the war. It is the core essence of the Council Resolution 2728 and 2735. To rescue hostages, creating more civilian casualties is not the way to go. China urges Israel to heed the resounding call of the international community for it to immediately cease military operations in Gaza and immediately stop the collective punishment of the Gazan population. We call on countries with important influence to bear on the parties to uphold an impartial position and make concrete and sincere efforts for the cessation of hostilities. Gaza is in the grip of a dire humanitarian situation. While Israeli military operations pose a grave threat to humanitarian workers, its suggestion or even accusation of inaction on the part of humanitarian organizations is unacceptable. Under international humanitarian law, Israel has an obligation to protect the safety of humanitarian organizations and workers and to ensure the rapid entry of sufficient humanitarian goods into Gaza and their safe and orderly delivery to all people in need. In West Bank, searches, arrests, and raids by Israeli enforcement agencies against Palestinians are daily occurrences. We call on Israel to effectively curb violence against the Palestinian civilians and stop undermining the basis of governance for the Palestinian National Authority, including by expeditiously returning the withheld tax revenues. China reiterates that settlement activities are in violation of international law and the Council Resolution 2334 and erode the prospect for a two-state solution. Israel must immediately cease all settlement activities. President, as repercussions of the Gaza conflict spill over fast, we are seeing worrisome situations in the Red Sea and along the Lebanon-Israel border. China is gravely concerned about the reported Israeli plans of military offensives against Lebanon. As Secretary General Guterres cautioned last Friday, the situation in the Middle East is very precarious and can't afford for Lebanon to become another Gaza. China calls on all parties to exercise restraint and refrain from actions that could exacerbate tensions, so as not to plunge the entire Middle East region into an even greater catastrophe. We call on the international community to take all necessary actions to bring about an immediate and lasting ceasefire in Gaza, an early relaunch of the two-state solution, and the realization of enduring peace and security in the Middle East at an early date. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland for your briefing. President, I'd like to highlight 3 areas since our last meeting. First, let me start by reaffirming the UK's commitment to the principles enshrined in Security Council Resolution 2334, which serves as a clear reinforcement of international support for a two-state solution. The suffering we have seen on and since the horrific attacks of the 7th of October underlines the importance, more than ever, of a diplomatic solution to this conflict, which guarantees the safety and security of both the Israeli and Palestinian people. We call for the immediate release of all the remaining hostages, including the return of those who have died in captivity. And we are appalled by reports of sexual violence and abuse. The UK stands firm in its condemnation of these heinous acts. The best way to get the hostages out is to get a deal done. We also urge Israel to let humanitarian aid enter Gaza through all crossing points immediately and guarantee deconfliction for aid convoys and other humanitarian work. We echo the Secretary-General's tribute to UN workers who have tragically lost their lives in this conflict, and we call upon Israel to ensure the protection of UN facilities and staff. The integrity of the UN and its ability to operate is paramount. It serves as a crucial lifeline for the many innocent civilians affected by this conflict. Second, the UK remains deeply concerned by the indiscriminate firing of rockets towards Israeli population centres, as noted in the Secretary-General's report. This must stop. We also note with concern the continuing construction of settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. We are clear. These settlements are illegal under international law. We reiterate our call on Israel to immediately and completely stop all settlement activities. We condemn the human rights abuses and incitement of violence against Palestinian communities in the West Bank, where the UK has taken action in the form of sanctions against a number of those individuals and groups responsible. We're also deeply concerned by Israel's suspension of revenue transfers to the Palestinian Authority and the risks to correspondent banking relations. Such measures harm chances for peace, security and stability. Finally, Mr. President, as the UK has said throughout, a negotiated pause in the fighting that leads to a sustainable ceasefire without a return to fighting is the best way to secure the release of the hostages, enable a significant scaling up of much-needed humanitarian aid, and lead to a permanent settlement of this issue. There is now a deal on the table, endorsed by this Council in Resolution 2735, to achieve those goals. The onus is on Hamas to accept it and end the suffering of the Palestinian people and the remaining hostages. We must then work towards a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution of Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security for both nations and the wider region. I thank you.
I thank the representative of United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
President, I am grateful to Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland for his briefing this morning and the Secretariat for the report. Ecuador appreciates and supports the work of the United Nations and its agencies. The Security Council has once again received and heard reports with growing figures for deaths, injuries and displaced persons, and which bear witness to the constant deterioration of the living conditions for the population of Gaza. Restrictions upon humanitarian operations continue. The Secretary-General reports that in May, just 50% of the humanitarian missions coordinated in Gaza were successfully facilitated. The military operations in Rafah have affected the already insufficient deliveries of aid. In addition, at least 120 hostages are still in captivity, almost 9 months since the terrorist acts perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023, which, once again, Ecuador unequivocally condemns. In addition, the strikes which seriously affect the civilian population and cause dozens of deaths and injuries in Gaza are continuing. The fighting is ceaseless, nor is there any halt to the indiscriminate launches of rockets towards Israel. This situation is particularly discouraging when 15 days ago the Council adopted a resolution supporting a proposed ceasefire, which, had it been implemented, would have already stopped the hostilities, allowed for the release of the hostages, facilitated the safe, sufficient and timely delivery of humanitarian aid to all those in need, and would also have contributed to reducing tensions throughout the region. President, negotiations must continue between the parties in pursuit of this agreement. My country reiterates its support for and gratitude for the efforts by Egypt, Qatar and the United States to this end. In this regard, it is not only necessary but obligatory to implement all the resolutions of this Council and to uphold the norms of international humanitarian law, which are also binding upon all parties, and violation of these brings with it serious responsibilities. With regard to the situation in the West Bank, Ecuador once again calls for compliance with the provisions of Resolution 2334. The increase in violence since the 7th of October and the continued settlement activities are worrisome. Statements and acts which undermine the viability of the two-state solution contribute to perpetuating the conflict and worsen the security situation. All protagonists must exhibit restraint and must avoid exacerbating tensions and demonstrate political will to reach agreements. Without such political will, the cycle of violence will inevitably repeat itself. Finally, all opportunities must be seized in order to take the first steps towards a peaceful, negotiated, definitive and just solution for the parties, with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, upon the basis of the 1967 borders and the relevant resolutions. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland for his informative briefing. More than 250 days of violence, grief, and suffering have passed, but still the situation worsens day by day. Japan upholds its condemnation against the heinous terror attacks by Hamas and others on October 7th, as well as the taking of the hostages. At the same time, Israel's military operations across Gaza continue unabated. Japan is appalled. Dozens of casualties, including civilians, are reported on a daily basis, amounting in total to more than 37,000 Palestinians killed, with untold tens of thousands more injured or buried under the rubble. We are also deeply alarmed to hear that 1.7 million people have been displaced, with many families having been displaced time after time. Those in southern Gaza suffer from poor access to shelter, health, food, and sanitation. Such a humanitarian situation is beyond description. Mr. President, 2 weeks ago, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2735, offering a glimmer of hope. The three-stage proposal would pave the way for the release of hostages and the increase of humanitarian aid, and eventually bringing the long-awaited ceasefire. However, the tragedy is still unfolding. Japan strongly urges Hamas to work in good faith based on Resolution 2735 without further delay. In this vein, we reiterate our support to the tireless and commendable diplomatic efforts of the United States, Qatar, and Egypt. Further, we amplify our call on Israel to lift impediment to humanitarian activities on the ground. We would also like to stress the staff and premises of the UN and other humanitarian agencies, including ICRC, must be protected. And we express our continuous support to the work of UNRWA as the backbone of the UN's humanitarian operation in Gaza. Mr. President, a ceasefire is necessary not only for Gaza, but to halt the destabilization of the region and beyond. The ongoing settlement activities in violation of international law. Japan once again strongly urges the government of Israel to stop its settlement activities. We also deplore the increase of settler violence and attacks on refugee camps in the West Bank. And most worryingly, exchanges of fire are rapidly increasing across the Blue Line. Japan echoes the Secretary General's statement last Friday. A further military escalation between Israel and Hezbollah would be disastrous for the people in Lebanon, Israel, and the region. All parties must exercise full restraint and immediately recommit ensuring a cessation of hostilities along the Blue Line in accordance with the Resolution 1701, and actors with influence on the parties also must take every effort towards this end. Even in this terrible moment, we must keep a political horizon as our goal. Japan maintains a two-state solution with Israel and Palestinians living side by side in peace and security is the only viable way to end this conflict and the plight it continues to cause. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland for his thorough briefing on the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2334 and the current situation in the occupied Palestine territory overall. We acknowledge the report of the Secretary General on this subject and note the lack of implementation of the provisions of Resolution 2334. Reports of plans for construction of housing units by the Jerusalem District Planning Committee across the Green Line in occupied East Jerusalem, illegal outposts in the occupied West Bank, and demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures across the OPT are serious violations of this resolution and pose a risk to peace efforts between Israel and Palestine. The continued hostilities in the Gaza Strip for the past 8 months and the volatile security situation across the Middle East undermines the prospects for durable and sustainable peace in the region. It is crucial at this stage, therefore, that the parties to the conflict in the Gaza Strip adhere to the call for a permanent ceasefire without any further delay. It is also important that attacks between Israel and other parties across the region in Lebanon, Yemen, Iran, and elsewhere cease immediately. Since 7 October 2023, there have been reports of over 37,000 Palestinian fatalities in the Gaza Strip, as well as over 1,200 fatalities in Israel. The consistent attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, including humanitarian aid workers and volunteers serving in the region, are outright violations of resolutions of this Council. This Council must continue to strongly condemn these violations to international human rights. Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned about the significant rise in the scale and depth of humanitarian needs in the Gaza Strip, which have been exacerbated by severe access restrictions, including the closure of key crossings, denials and delays in processing humanitarian relief access, the destruction of essential infrastructure, such as roads, and the presence of debris and unexploded ordnance in the armed conflict further limits the capacity of humanitarian organizations to deliver vital assistance at scale to the suffering population. We empathize with the 1.7 million internally displaced men, women, and children in the Gaza Strip, crammed in congested areas and exposed to unfavorable weather conditions. Unsanitary conditions, overcrowding in makeshift shelters, and inadequate water have resulted in an increase in waterborne diseases. Mr. President, at this crucial stage of finding common ground for peace negotiations between Israel and Palestine, the situation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, demands our sustained attention. Recent developments between settlers and Palestinians indicate the potential for possible escalation and increased casualties. To this end, permit me to emphasize the following points in ensuring compliance with Resolution 2334. Firstly, we reaffirm that any attempt to expand settlement activities in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, constitutes a flagrant violation under international law and a major obstacle to the achievement of the two-state solution. Secondly, we reiterate our call for parties to the conflict to stop all violence against civilians and honor their obligations as outlined in international law, including international humanitarian law, and all ICJ orders issued on this matter. In light of this, we demand the safe release of the remaining 129 hostages held by Hamas since the 7th October 2023 without further delay. Also, parties to the conflict are reminded to refrain from unilateral and provocative actions, incitement, and inflammatory rhetoric that undermines trust, erodes confidence, and limits the space for dialogue and negotiations. These actions are counterproductive to the aim of having two effective states coexisting side by side. Protracted military attacks and restrictive administrative measures being deployed by Israel against Palestine ultimately destroy its ability to develop the good governance, effective security, and sustainable socio-economic development conditions necessary to support peace and security in the region. In conclusion, my delegation urges parties to the conflict to respect and abide by the decisions of this Council as outlined in all its resolutions, including 2334, 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. We emphasize the binding nature of all the resolutions and the implications associated with non-compliance under international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to extend my gratitude to the Secretary General for his report and to Mr. Wennesland for his briefing. Once again, we convene to address the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, nearly 9 months after the Israeli occupying power initiated its senseless aggression against the defenseless Palestinian people. There is no need to reiterate the figures. The humanitarian situation in Gaza, already catastrophic, has further deteriorated. People are dying from starvation. They are dying from hunger in Gaza. This is the cruel reality. The culprit is well known: the Israeli occupying power that must be held accountable for this devastation. Mrs. Nevi Pillay, chair of the Commission of Inquiry on the occupying Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, has stated, and I quote, "The Commission concluded that Israeli authorities were responsible for war crime against humanity, using starvation as a method of war, forcible transfer, and cruel and inhuman treatment." End of quote. The objective of this barbarity is clear: a second Nakba. Yes, the occupying power aimed to destroy Gaza and displace its population. An Israeli minister, has even stated, "We do not have an interest in governing the people of Gaza, but also we cannot live near a state of human animals." We echo the Secretary General warning against the risk of further escalation in the region. The risk of a Middle East conflict widening is real now. It must be avoided. Continued violence serves no one's interest. Mr. President, while the situation in Gaza is catastrophic, the Secretary General's report clearly indicates that conditions in the West Bank are not better. In this regard, I would like to highlight the following points. First, the situation in the West Bank will deteriorate further if the occupying power does not cease its policy of terror, of expansion, of settlement. We call for full compliance with Resolution 2334. Security Council resolutions are binding and must be implemented. And our meeting today is supposed to monitor the very implementation of this resolution and also to draw the conclusion. Second, settler terror have reached an unprecedented level, often perpetrated under the protection of the Israeli Defense Forces, who, under the international humanitarian law, have the obligation to protect the Palestinian civilians. We demand accountability for the perpetrator of this act of terror. Third, provocation by settlers in Al-Quds Sharif and at Al-Aqsa Mosque will definitely fuel tensions and risk further escalation. We condemn this repeated provocative assault on the holy sites and reaffirm that the entire area of Al-Aqsa Mosque is an exclusive Muslim place of worship. The historic and legal status of the holy site must be respected. Fourth, the Palestinian Authority should be empowered to assume its responsibilities. We condemn the occupying authority decision to suspend the transfer of clearance revenues collected on behalf of the Palestinians. These revenues belong to the Palestinians and are not a charity from the Israeli occupying power. They must be released without delay. Fifth, if those violations have occurred elsewhere, sanctions, yes, sanctions would have already been imposed. We, therefore, demand sanctions against the occupying power for non-compliance with Security Council resolution, including Resolution 2334. In conclusion, Mr. President, those who can believe that they can uproot the Palestinians from their land by force are mistaken. The Israeli occupying power plans will ultimately fall, not because of international intervention or in change in the Israeli behavior, but because the Palestinian, the people of Palestine, have learned from the Nakba of their ancestor. They will not leave their homeland. They will continue their struggle until they fully enjoy their right, including the right of self-determination and the establishment of their state with Al-Quds Sharif as a capital. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the Republic of Korea. I also thank Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland for his briefing. International norms regarding Israeli settlement in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967 are obvious. Paragraph 1 of Resolution 2334 clearly provides that such a settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, constitute a flagrant violation under international law and a major obstacle to the achievement of the two-state solution and peace. The Republic of Korea is deeply worried that settlement activities by the Israeli government and illegal settlers are not only ongoing, but indeed expanding even during this dire juncture. We urge Israel to cease such activities and to respect relevant international law and UN resolutions. The adoption of Resolution 2735 earlier this month showed the strong support of this Council for diplomatic efforts by the US, Egypt, and Qatar to achieve an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages. And we were highly hopeful for the success of the deal. Sadly, we are yet to hear any news on the finalization of the deal. And as of now, the conflict in Gaza has not shown any signs of abatement. However, we expect that negotiations will be maintained and urge all parties, notably Hamas, to say yes to the deal for the release of hostages and an immediate ceasefire and to implement the Council resolutions. We note with serious concern that the Commission of the Inquiry report found evidence of grave crimes, including war crimes and crimes against humanity, committed on and after the 7th of October by Hamas and Israeli security forces. We remain horrified by the heinous and unjustifiable terrorist attacks by Hamas and other militant groups, including killing and sexual violence. We are also gravely alarmed by Israeli acts in Gaza, including widespread attacks against the civilians, resulting in massive fatalities and destruction. We call for accountability for the crimes described in the COI report. We also observe that the SG report on the implementation of Resolution 2334 details ongoing violence in the West Bank, either by the Israeli security forces and settlers or by Palestinians. We call on Israel to respect the rights of Palestinians and to take measures to prevent and to punish settlers' violence. Also, in accordance with Resolution 2334, calling for a halt to all provocative actions and incitement, we urge both parties to cease all inflammatory rhetoric, including Israeli high-level officials' remarks promoting settlement expansion and population transfer. We also appeal for a cessation of Israel's withholding of tax revenue to the Palestinian Authority. As Resolution 2735 reiterates, the international community has an unwavering commitment to the two-state solution, and to advance meaningful steps toward this goal, the current conflict in Gaza must come to an end as soon as possible. All the hostilities in the region, including those across the blue line between Israel and Lebanon, should also cease. Now is the time to move on toward the realization of peace for all. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, I thank Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland for his presentation of the Secretary General's quarterly report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. The report of the Secretary General tells us a story you know only too well, but to which you should never grow accustomed. It is a story of dispossession and displacement of communities by violence and unjust laws and orders. A story of colonial settlement, annexation, undeniable, unrelenting, unapologetic. The story of indiscriminate attacks against Palestinians, mass killing and maiming of an entire civilian population, mass graves, attacks on hospitals and on the UN and its personnel, the killing of humanitarian workers, the wanton destruction of civilian infrastructure and of the conditions of life. It is the story of Israelis' continued attempt to destroy Palestine and its people, and the world's failure to put an end to it. I did not come here to speak about policies that you all know and you all denounce. I am here to make a wake-up call to all of us that this tragedy underway has been written a long time ago, that all the signs were there and yet no action was taken to address this existential threat we are facing. This is the time to break the taboo of Israelis' impunity. Let me say this in the clearest way I can. No arms to kill us, no money to colonize us, no trade to rob us. Every state has a duty to start from there, to make sure its government, entities, companies, and citizens do not contribute in any way anymore to Israelis' crimes against the Palestinian people. Let me commend all the countries who have actively supported Palestinian rights, supported our people and our government, provided humanitarian relief, taken legal action, adopted concrete measures aimed at putting an end to these crimes, adopted sanctions against settlements and violent, extremist settlers, and of course, the countries that have recognized the State of Palestine and supported its membership in the UN. And for those that have not yet have done so, I urge them to take the correct step of recognizing the State of Palestine as an investment in peace and saving the two-state solution. But much more is needed to restrain the Israeli government, who, while you help us build, destroys, while you finance, steals, while you promote Palestinian rights and independence, deny us our rights, and acts to destroy our state, and with it, the two-state solution and any chance for peace. Whose will is stronger? The will of the extremists in Israel or the will of the peacemakers around the world? The Israeli extremists in power are ready to do whatever is necessary to destroy peace. Are you ready to do whatever is necessary to salvage it? We will do our part, as we have done in the worst of circumstances, with an ironclad commitment to the rule of international law. But the party breaching the law every single day must be held accountable. The laws are adopted to ensure justice, and there can be no justice without enforcement. You cannot have one party acting with responsibility while the other is acting in full impunity and expect a different outcome than the appalling situation we face. This Israeli government is defying every measure you take to support our freedom and to achieve shared peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis alike. They take punitive measures against us and against you. They are openly saying, announcing for the whole world to hear, that in response to our and your actions grounded in international law and aiming at upholding it, they will commit new crimes. They openly declare that they will further settle the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, that they will breach the historic and legal status quo and continue with their assaults on the sanctity of the holy sites, and that they will withhold Palestinian tax revenues. They declare so shamelessly, with no concern for the law, convinced that their impunity will live on. That is the arrogance of fundamentalists, of colonizers. They attack their closest allies as if they were enemies just because they criticize Israeli policies, while showing no hesitation when attacking and insulting all of you. And you hear it so rapidly and often in this chamber, in the General Assembly, and in other places. That means criticism is not enough. Consequences are what is needed. Mr. President, let me speak of those who are only mentioned at the very end of this report and barely ever mentioned in this chamber, left to their suffering and terrible ordeal as if they were not deserving of recognition and respect of their humanity and rights. We are a nation of prisoners. There is virtually no single Palestinian family that did not or does not have prisoners in Israeli occupation jails that were already suffering from arbitrary arrests, torture, and ill treatment, sexual abuse, and violence long before the 7th of October. Since then, they have been living in sheer hell. We are the nation of 1 million Palestinian prisoners. Thousands of Palestinians have been abducted, tortured, many killed while in detention, several amputated as a result of their ill treatment. 4 times more Palestinians have died in Israeli detention in the last 8 months than the number of prisoners who have died in Guantanamo in 20 years. 4 times more Palestinians, let me repeat, have died in Israeli detentions in the last 8 months, more than the number of prisoners who have died in Guantanamo in 20 years. Abduction, torture, enforced disappearance, the use of prisoners as human shields, and sexual violence against men, women, and children, yes, children, are not worthy of outrage if the victims are Palestinians. Some of the first rules of humanitarian law adopted hundreds of years ago were about the treatment of prisoners because they were vulnerable in the hands of the enemy, and it was considered an indignity to harm them when they were defenseless. And this was to protect combatants. So imagine when the detainees are civilians, when they are children. An essential part of the freedom of our people is the freedom of our prisoners. Mr. President, in conclusion, as have been roundly affirmed around this table repeatedly, the resolutions of this Council are binding, including Resolution 2735. We call for their full implementation without delay and as a matter of urgency. Resolution 2735 is clear that there are 3 phases in the ceasefire proposal, including Phase 2 that foresees a permanent end to hostilities and full Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. The proposal is not subject to a destructive pick and choose that voids the proposal of its meaning. We are well aware of the objective of the conflicting messages from Israeli leaders, notably Netanyahu himself, suggesting this is all a scheme and that the assault will continue under any circumstances. The aim is to sabotage the U.S. initiative without taking the blame for it, to sabotage the efforts of Egypt and Qatar and of the international community as a whole. The best way to frustrate Netanyahu's goals is by achieving an immediate ceasefire. Achieve an immediate ceasefire now, so that not to allow him to continue playing with the minds of so many of you. The best way to save human life is by achieving an immediate ceasefire. We want to save lives. All lives, not only Palestinian lives. An immediate ceasefire is indispensable for all, for Palestinians first and foremost, to stop the mass killing and maiming and arbitrary arrest and wanton destruction, to stop the mass starvation of our people in Gaza, of whom 96% of them face catastrophic levels of food insecurity, but also for Israelis held captive and their families, for our region, which cannot bear further escalation and destruction, for our humanity, for what remains of our international law-based order. It is time to end this illegal, abhorrent 57-year of occupation. Time to free the Palestinian people from the endless oppression and torment their ruthless occupier has inflicted on them for decades and vows to continue inflicting without end. Driven by its colonial agenda, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and now genocide, the pillars of its policies against the Palestinian people. No one can survive by simply relying on the power of the sword, especially a sword provided by another. Justice and peace are the best guarantees for our peoples. We call on you to go further and act faster in ensuring they are not forever lost in this assault, leaving us prey to a reality that will devour us all. Blessed be the peacemakers. This is the time for them to demonstrate they have the will, the courage to do what is needed before it is too late. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just this past week, the international community and the United Nations commemorated the International Day for the Elimination of Sexual Violence in Conflict. While the world advocated for the eradication of sexual violence as a weapon of war and terror, this is the reality of 16 Israeli women who are still being held hostage by Hamas terrorists in Gaza ever since the October 7th massacre. In all, 120 Israeli hostages are still being held captive in harsh conditions under mental, physical, and sexual abuse. One of them is Naama Levy, who turned 20 years old in captivity just 3 days ago, surrounded by terrorists and rapists for the last 262 days. Members of the Council, why is this Council not focused on addressing the dire humanitarian situation of the hostages? What does this Council have to say to Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, Elia Cohen and Or Levy, whose brutal kidnapping video from October 7th was released yesterday? What would you say to their families who watched their children being dragged from a shelter, bloody, scarred and hurt, being abused throughout their torturous drive into Gaza? Colleagues, Hamas's refusal to release the hostages through diplomacy proves that the efforts to bring our hostages home must also include military means. The recent IDF rescue operation that brought 4 hostages back home was an example of how this can be achieved. Israel stands firm on our principles, and they have not changed. We will continue until the last remaining hostage is returned, and we will not stop until Hamas's military and governing capabilities are dismantled. We are committed to the Israeli proposal, which President Biden has welcomed. Our position has not changed. These have been our goals from day one. As for the humanitarian situation in Gaza, since the beginning of the war, more than 36,000 aid trucks have been brought into Gaza. This is over 682,000 tons of humanitarian aid, which has included food, water, shelter equipment, medical supplies, fuel, gas, and more. The problem was and remains in the collection and distribution of this aid by the United Nations. Nearly all United Nations requests for the coordination of humanitarian convoys have been and are being approved, and the daily pauses in operations against terrorists continue to enable the distribution of aid. Yet Hamas continues to attack aid convoys, serving their dual objectives of stealing food and supplies for terrorist combatants while disrupting the delivery of aid. On June 14th, Hamas fired 5 projectiles towards Israel from a humanitarian aid area in central Gaza. 2 of them crossed into Israeli territory and 3 fell within Gaza. Where was the Council's outrage at this? Mr. President, Hamas is entirely to blame for this conflict. They launched an unprovoked, brutal invasion into Israel, a sovereign country, murdered innocent civilians and took hundreds of hostages. They are still holding our loved ones in Gaza while continuing their attacks on Israel. They use Gazans as human shields while pursuing the genocidal aims. Alongside this, more and more weapons of the Hamas terrorists continue to be discovered inside UN facilities, universities, civilian homes, mosques, and other civilian sites. It is imperative that this Council finally holds Hamas accountable, assigns the blame where it belongs, and unequivocally condemns terror and its sponsors. As a Security Council, it is your responsibility to exert relentless pressure on terrorists, whether Hamas in Gaza or Hezbollah in Lebanon. Over the past months, Hezbollah has increased its attacks on Israel, firing thousands of rockets, suicide drones, and missiles from Lebanon towards Israel on a daily basis. Israel will not allow the Hezbollah terror organization to continue attacking its territory and citizens. In an all-out war, Hezbollah, which has been violating Security Council resolutions for years, endangering both the Israeli and Lebanese people, as well as UN peacekeepers, will pay the price. I thank you, Mr. President.
Representative of Israel for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Thank you, sir.